Alright guys, if you clicked on this video, you've found my absolute favorite cold plunge option, the chest freezer conversion. If you're curious to know what my list looks like for cold plunging on every budget, check out the Ultimate Guide to Cold Plunging on Any Budget Parts 1 and 2. But if you clicked on this video, I imagine you've already made up your mind. This video will be a complete tutorial, starting with the basic chest freezer conversion all the way to the advanced. So if you find this video useful, please like it, share it, leave a comment, and please consider subscribing. And lastly, all items I use will be listed below. After we finish the video on the Ultimate Guide to Cold Plunging on Any Budget Part 1, Marcus has really stepped up his cold plunging game. He was now interested in getting his own chest freezer conversion. Since I wanted to do a video on how I built my cold plunge, I told him I'd build it for him at cost. So I did. The price here varies quite a bit, but it's up to you. If you're willing to spend a little bit more money and put a little bit more time and effort into it, it'll be worth it. You'll get something substantially better looking, and it'll be a lot easier to maintain on the back end. For my project, I wanted to see how cheap I can get a professional looking one that's self-maintaining. Alright, let's get to it. When shopping for a chest freezer, be sure to find one that can fit you up to your neck and ideally has an enamel paint coating on the inside. Some chest freezers come with a metal coating on the inside, and although I will be coating the inside with a pond shield, I think it's a great secondary layer of protection if it's enamel. Plus, it allows you the option to skip the pond shield step if cost is a concern to you. A third recommendation when picking out a chest freezer is look for one where the lid holds itself open. We don't want the lid falling and hitting our head while we're using the chest freezer. You can install a locking hinge if you must, but since we're already shopping, might as well look for one that has it. Rather than buying a new chest freezer, I found a used one on Marketplace that fit all these criteria for $150. If you bought a new chest freezer or you want to skip my refurbishment, you can skip to this time code. The main reason I went with it, the chest freezer worked great, and despite a couple stains on the inside at the seams, the enamel was in great shape. It had surface rust, but this was easily refurbished. I started by removing the stickers. Some of them were on there pretty good, but this wasn't a huge deal. I was going to sand it down anyway. I also cleaned out where the compressor was housed. It was pretty dusty in there. I fully disassembled it by removing the lid hinges. This would make painting a lot easier. The light cable that was attached to the lid did not work. It was very badly damaged. Since I planned on using LEDs, I chose to remove it. I separated the lid and put the freezer on its side. This made accessing the inside a bit easier. I inspected the internal components to make sure everything was in order. Everything looked good. I traced that damaged cable to the inside and cut it out at the base. I segregated the hot and neutral. I tied it off with heat shrink and electrical tape. This ensured that nothing would short out. Once everything was secured, I put that back together. Once the stickers and logos were removed, I began to sand the outside. Sanding allows the paint to adhere a little bit better. I'll be using Rust-Oleum paint. Although it's a paint primer combo, I like to rough up the outside to help it stick a little better. I then began to sand away the surface rust. When sanding, remove as much as you can. Again, all of this rust was surface area, none of it seeped into the structure or any of the components. I began to apply the paint. As the name denotes, Rust-Oleum helps neutralize rust, so rust removal does not need to be perfect. I did a couple solid layers of paint here. I sanded and painted the chest freezer in sections. This is why some of the stickers are still visible. I cut a lot of the repetitive stuff such as rust removal, sanding, and painting from this video for brevity. I then allowed the paint to cure. After I let the white paint cure for 24 hours, I applied a clear coat. I did a light sanding to help the clear coat adhere. Just don't do too much because you'll remove the paint. Although the paint primer was a gloss sheen, the clear coat is an added layer of protection. Just as I had with the paint, I allowed the clear coat to dry for 24 hours. I treated the lid similar to the main portion of the chest freezer. I removed the hinges so I can paint them individually and re-grease them as well. I began to sand the lid, targeting the surface rust. Again, since the following steps are a bit repetitive, I cut it down for brevity. As mentioned before, this will help the paint adhere better as well. I flipped the lid over to clean the underside. I used rubbing alcohol to clean the dirt and grime. The seal looked worse than it actually was. Some patience and elbow grease restored it quite a bit. I fully disassembled the hinges. This would make cleaning, painting, and re-greasing a lot easier. I sanded the hinge housing to enable better paint adhesion. Once the lid and the hinge housings were sanded, I then began to paint them both. I started off with the lid. I did a couple solid coats here. I then moved on to the hinge housing and did a couple solid coats here as well. I allowed the paint to dry for 24 hours. I then went over the lid and the hinge housings with a clear coat as well. I allowed the clear coat to dry for 24 hours. Once the lid and the hinge housings were completely cured, I began to clean the springs. I then applied grease to the hinge housings where the springs would make contact. This will prevent premature wear and limit squeaking when opening and closing the chest freezer. I reassembled the hinges. When everything was assembled, I attached the hinges back to the lid. I will reattach the lid to the rest of the chest freezer at a later time. I kept it off simply for ease of access. It is not a must to have it removed for the following steps. However, it didn't make sense for me to reattach it yet. So, for about $40 in paint and some elbow grease, I was able to make this chest freezer look a lot more new. Going this route saved us a lot of money. Now we're on to the actual first step of the chest freezer conversion. We're going to seal the seams of the chest freezer. Essentially, we're trying to make it watertight. Here, we're going to use JB Waterwell. Each tube costs about $7 each, and if you buy packs of 2, you can get a little cheaper. The JB Waterwell will be applied to all seams on the inside of the chest freezer. How many of these tubes you buy depend on how many seams are on the inside of your chest freezer. This chest freezer actually did not have a lot of seams, so I only needed about 8 tubes. These 8 tubes cost me just under $49. As mentioned before, I will do a pond armor on the inside, but this is just another layer of protection. Anything we can do to stop water getting to the inside of the chest freezer's components, the better. Although it's not necessary, I recommend scuffing up the area where the JB Waterwell will be applied. It helps it stick better. Wipe it clear with alcohol and prep for application. This stuff comes in a tube where you mash together 2 parts for it to be activated. If you see zebra stripes, it must be mixed more. It needs to be one solid color. One thing you'll figure out very quickly is this stuff gets really sticky to your fingers. The trick you can do is get a spray bottle from the dollar store, fill it with water, and just spray it on your hand so it doesn't stick to them. And this part's a bit tedious. It's the same song and dance over and over and over. Make a little rope out of it, apply it to the seams, press it down until there's no gaps, do the same process over and over again. Once that section of JB Waterwell is applied, you can use a little bit of water and smooth it out with your hand. It just makes it look a lot nicer. Take your time and don't miss anything. I didn't have a lot of faith in the cap that came with the drain. I'm pretty sure that it was going to let water out. Obviously, we don't want this. To remedy this, I took a wad of JB Waterwell and just covered it up. JB Waterwell is great because it's made specifically to seal water. It can be used in potable tanks, which is drinkable water. This means there's going to be no dangerous chemicals that can leach out. Also, it can be used underwater. The 2-part activator allows it to cure while it's completely submerged. If there's an emergency crack that appears, you can apply it quickly without having to drain out the water. And not only is it super strong, it sets in as little as 25 minutes and completely cures in as little as an hour. Now, if your chest freezer's enamel's in great shape, there is no metal showing, and the JB Waterwell is completely cured, you don't need the next step. Skip to the section where I use wood supports and you'll go from there. But I wanted to go all out here. For $60 and a little bit more time, we can get a really professional looking cold plunge conversion. An extra layer of protection I decided to go with was stuff called Pond Shield. It was also known as pond armor. It's a 2-part epoxy you mix together, made specifically for waterproofing ponds, and lasts for a very long time. Per the instructions, in preparation for application, I sanded the entire interior of the chest freezer with 6-through grit sandpaper. This helps it adhere. I taped around the top with painter's tape to make those lines look really clean. I began to mix the epoxy resin ratios. I added 90% isopropyl alcohol to reduce the viscosity. This makes the application a little bit smoother. The color I went with is called Competition Blue. Although Pond Shield comes in different colors, I feel this dark blue is the most applicable for cold plunging. When mixing the epoxy ratios, be careful to do it very slowly. We don't want to add bubbles to the mixture. Mixing wands are great because they spin fast enough to mix the epoxy as needed, but not so fast that it pulls bubbles into the mixture. Once everything was one solid color and viscosity, I began to apply it. On my first chest freezer conversion, I tried to apply the epoxy using a paint tray and a roller. I found this to be a little bit of a waste of time. I also needlessly wasted a little bit of the epoxy left behind in the tray. It made a lot more sense for me to just pour it on the bottom and pull it up on the sides as needed. So that's what I did with this one. I was sure to apply even coverage everywhere. Allow the first coat to cure no more than 10 hours. We want it to be slightly tacky enough to adhere to the second coat. If we go past this point and it cures too much, we're gonna have to scuff up that first coat to apply the second. When we do apply that second coat, it's exactly the same as the first. Mix it and apply it as needed. As mentioned before, Pond Shield is made specifically for waterproofing ponds. This means there are no toxic chemicals, it's made to withstand the elements, and adds an additional layer of protection in tandem with the JB Waterwell in regards to sealing. This chest freezer is just over 10 cubic feet. This kit's perfect because it allows me to cut the amounts in half to do 2 thick coats. After the second coat began to cure, I removed the painter's tape. Allow the final coat to cure for at least 24 hours before adding water. Honestly, I would recommend at least 3 days to be safe. Once it was completely cured, I began to reassemble it. I attached the lid I had removed, and I made adjustments to the springs as needed to make sure it stays open so it does not fall and hit our head. Once everything was fully assembled, I relocated the cold plunge from the barn to the garage. This is where I was going to fill it up and test it. As you know, water is very heavy. This chest freezer is just over 10 cubic feet. We don't want to just put this on the ground and fill it with water. These honestly aren't built for that. So to distribute the weight evenly, I measured out 2x4s that can be laid across the bottom. For about $20 in pressure treated wood, I cut some pieces that can be laid to distribute the weight. I even cut smaller ones for the end. If we did not provide additional support to the chest freezer and only used the 4 legs to support it, it most certainly would bow and break. I used 4 large 2x4s with 2 smaller ones at the end. As strange as it may seem, by doing it this way, we're actually putting the weight everywhere except on the legs. Providing additional support to your chest freezer is one of the most important steps here. So take your time and ensure there is good contact on the bottom. Once I felt the chest freezer was properly supported, it was time to fill it up with water. At this point, since I was only filling up the chest freezer to test it and make sure it was working as it should for the next couple days, I wasn't too concerned about filtering the water coming out of the hose. But if you're interested in filtering the water to make it the most clean possible, you can attach a filter to a hose. However, I've noticed it doesn't do a great job at getting rid of rust. I didn't do it here, and you can tell, but I wasn't terribly concerned about the water's purity because this was only temporary. Filling up your water can take anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes depending on your water pressure. The water came out of the faucet at 55 degrees. Okay, we're on the home stretch on the basic chest freezer conversion. There are only 3 more things I recommend you purchase: a temperature controller, a GFI outlet, and a switch. I will go a little bit more depth into power here shortly, but for now, all you need to know is GFI outlets are a safety relay. It shuts off power when it senses unsafe conditions. Basically, it's trying to protect you from getting electrocuted. They come in different flavors and may already be in the location you're going to use your chest freezer. The switch is a manual shutoff for all devices plugged into it. In this case, I turn off the switch before I use my chest freezer. You can unplug the chest freezer every time you get in and out, but I'm going to explain why I prefer to use the switch later on. And the last thing you want to buy is a temperature controller. As you guessed it, it controls the temperature. All this device does is allow power to things plugged into it. Since we're maintaining water temperature, we'll put the sensor directly into the water. I don't believe this Inkbird is particularly waterproof, but hot glue does a great job of sealing that type of stuff. Sure, they make temperature controllers that are waterproof, but I've worked with Inkbirds in the past at my jobs. It's a really reliable temperature controller. I don't like the idea of drilling into the chest freezer itself. I don't want to strike a cooling line. Instead, they sell these threaded magnets, so I just hung it off that. You'll see more of these magnets here in a bit. How the temperature controller works is you put the probe in the water. It senses the water is too warm. It turns on the chest freezer. The chest freezer will then bring down the water temperature until it reaches that 40 degrees. Then it shuts it off. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. For about $380, we have a very good looking chest freezer conversion. It looks just about new to me. It's super well protected and self-maintaining in regards to temperature. But if you want to go a little above and beyond, here's a couple additional things I purchased. Just to be extra safe, for $20, I got a custom-made sign to remind me to turn off the power switch before use. For $18, I bought a remote control set of battery-powered LEDs that I can stick on the inside. They're magnetized, waterproof, and change colors. It adds to the ambiance and allows me to see where I'm stepping when getting in and getting out. Since they're battery-powered, we can use them while doing the cold plunge. And again, if you wanted to stop right here, that's okay. You could do that. It just means you would have to change the water a little bit more frequently. But if you're willing to put in a little bit more time and spend a little bit more money, we can get that chest freezer that is professional looking and generally self-maintaining. Let's start with filtering. Keeping the water clean is fairly straightforward. Water filters clean out the large particulates. I found a water filter and ozone generator combo online for about $87. I'll get into ozone here in a minute. This filter is a good choice because it's fairly large, it's fully submersible, and it's easy to modify with additional filtering. It's a 4-stage filter, which means the sponges get smaller and smaller to filter out the smaller particulates. I like to take the 4th stage filter and modify it. For $20, I got a roll of charcoal filter. I cut the squares as I needed. I like to use charcoal filters because they can remove certain chemicals, particularly organic chemicals from water. I bought this roll 2 years ago on my first chest freezer conversion, and I'm still cutting pieces from it to this day. After the carbon filter, for $18, I bought a roll of Filter First Pad. It's a 2-stage filter and does a great job filtering those particulates even further. I cut 2 pieces here. And the last roll I bought was Polishing Filter Pad. For $27, it'll get that water crystal clear. You put the polishing filtering pad in very last. Again, I'm still using the first rolls I bought 2 years ago, so it'll last a very long time. Next, we're going to talk about sanitation. Sanitation prevents the growth of any type of bacteria. As I covered, the fully submersible filter came with an ozone generator, and it plugs directly into the filter. How ozone generators work is it splits oxygen O2 molecules apart and takes those oxygen atoms and attaches it to make O3. That additional atom is very unstable and wants to normalize very quickly. O3 wants to become O2 as soon as possible, so that oxygen atom will jump off to whatever it possibly can. In this case, it can jump on bacteria or microbes and kill them doing this. O3 or ozone is a great way of keeping your water sanitized. One thing worth mentioning is ozone can be potentially dangerous to breathe in large quantities. That O3 in your lungs can damage those cells as well. It's nothing to panic about because it wants to neutralize fairly quickly. It just means I recommend setting it to a fairly low setting, basically barely on, and then when you open up your chest freezer, let it air out for maybe just a moment before you get in. UV light or ultraviolet light is another form of sanitation. When illuminated, it kills bacteria. It does this because the wavelength for UV is very damaging to small cell organisms. When it hits them, it causes damage to their DNA and kills them. I found a fully submersible UV light for $19 online. Although it's fully submersible and waterproof, I like to ensure it's sealed with hot glue. And rather than having this continuously run, I like to have it run on 15-minute cycles, 4 to 6 times a day, using a manual timer. I like to use UV in tandem with ozone. As you probably know, UV does carry its own risks. We don't want direct exposure to your skin or eyes. Neither one of these safety risks for ozone or UV should be an issue because your power should be turned off before you use your cold plunge anyway. My first UV light I bought lasted over a year. Since then, I've had a couple flaky ones. I'll link below if I found a higher quality one that I would recommend. Another item worth getting is a wave maker. It's just another way to keep the water clean. Still water tends to grow bacteria, so the more the water is moving around, the clearer it's going to be. It also does a great job of kicking particulates off the bottom and knocking it around so eventually it can hit the submersible filter. The cable's a little bit short, which begs for me to mention, when researching accessories for your cold plunge, consider the length of the power cable when doing so. I ran it off an extension cord, and just to be safe with that, I sealed that with hot glue as well. Maybe janky and maybe overkill, but hey, I'd rather be safe than sorry. Anyway, this wave maker is magnetic, which is perfect. It'll stick right on the inside of the chest freezer. If we didn't add those additional components, we would have to change the water just about weekly. With the sanitation and regular rinsing of the filter, I change the water once every 1 to 3 months. Now that we have all these extra components, what are we going to do with them? A great way to house all these components is a control box. We're going to route power to and from this box and store all of the main components to it as well. It's going to look classy when we mount it, and it's weatherproof with a rubber seal, which means it can get wet on top and it'll be fine. I drilled a hole on the bottom using a hole saw to route the components here. That way, if the water falls on top of it, it'll just drip to the sides, and the likelihood that water scoops underneath and inside is incredibly low. You can use a computer desk grommet or a rubber grommet. Grommets aren't necessary, but they'll help keep unwanted things out, and they just look a little bit more classy. Once everything worked individually, I took everything back out of the chest freezer and started to assemble it inside of the control box. This will take some finagling and you'll have to figure out how to make things work individually, but patience, proper housekeeping, and proper cable management is key. It may take a few times to get everything the way you want it, but hey, that's all part of the process. Inside the control box, we now have the temperature controller, the ozone generator, the mechanical timer for the UV light, and the main power strip that we'll be plugging into the wall. Since we're about to plug this boy in, I think it'd be a great time to discuss power. We have all the components housed inside the control box and running off of one power strip. You may want to get a power strip that has a little bit longer cable. This one was a bit short, so I added a 3-foot extension cord. I know some people may have concerns about how much current is going through this power strip, but I assure you this can handle it. This power strip's rated for 15 amps, but doesn't a chest freezer use a lot of electricity? Actually, not as much as you might think. The average chest freezer pulls only about 5 amps, with only 10 amps momentarily upon startup. Just to verify this, I ran it through my electricity monitor. This device can tell me a lot of information about electricity. In this case, I'm interested in the max current draw. I have it set so it'll tell me the peak value. I ensured all the components inside the control box were turned on and ready to go, and the chest freezer would be ready to turn on immediately. This means everything was going to pull current at once. I'm trying to emulate the scenario where most amps will be drawn. During that initial startup, which is typically going to be the highest amperage drawn, it maxed out at 7.8 amps, just about half what that power strip is rated for. We have plenty of wiggle room. And again, that's only a momentary draw. After that initial current draw, the chest freezer and all components turned on was only using about 1.72 amps. The long and short of it is, I think you'll be just fine using this power strip. As discussed before, I don't want to drill into the main portion of the chest freezer. I don't want to hit a cooling line. These magnetic rubber feet are great. I'll attach these threaded rubber feet to the back of the control box using nuts. These magnets are very strong. It'll more than suffice. In this next step, I'm going to drill a hole in the lid. Now this is something you'll want to be careful with. Some chest freezers have wiring to power lights in there. My Polar box does that. I was very cognizant of where I was drilling that hole. In this case, I wasn't concerned. As you saw earlier with this chest freezer, I completely removed that power light. So if your chest freezer has a light, just be careful where you're drilling. You may be able to reach out to the manufacturer and get a schematic to see where that light is being routed. Be very careful here. We don't want to cut into the light's electrical cable. I laid down some cloth to catch the debris from drilling the hole. I don't want that to be getting in the water. Take your time and be careful. Once I poked through one side, I came through the other. I drilled a little through the bottom and a little through the top. Eventually, I poked all the way through. Again, I like to use grommets because they'll keep stuff out and also keep the cool air in. Overall, it just looks clean. It makes the hole look better. Once the hole was drilled, the grommets were installed, I started to route the cables for the components going inside the chest freezer to the control box. I like to bounce back and forth to make sure the cable tensions aren't too tight when the chest freezer is opened and closed. I'm a little bit OCD with my cable management, but zip ties and flush cutters are your friend here. It'll prevent things from snagging, and it just makes it look overall more professional. One thing you may notice with the zip ties is I zip tied all the power cables together and then the ozone gently after that. If you don't see any bubbles coming out of your filter, that means there's a pinch in the tubing and it may be too tight. I like to add a P-clip to prevent rubbing and help take some of that tension off. Now we're on to the most important thing with using a chest freezer, safety. I'm going to show you how I approach this topic. Typically, people unplug the chest freezer before getting inside, and I think this is a good practice. But I do things a little bit differently. I turn off both the ground fault interrupter and the manual switch instead of unplugging the chest freezer. The reason I do this is because many large appliances have a thing inside of it called a capacitor. Capacitors are sort of like high-powered batteries, but they release all their energy at once. It's instantaneous and can be very dangerous. They can store their energy and release it at any time. So even if a chest freezer is unplugged, a capacitor could still have a charge inside of it. To remedy this, there's a thing called a bleed resistor typically installed. A bleed resistor's main goal is to dissipate that electricity in a safe manner. However, if there's a faulty bleed resistor, that capacitor can hold a dangerous charge for many days. Although it's very unlikely, if you have a faulty bleed resistor and there's a leak in your chest freezer, you may get a shock. Well, what does any of that have to do with me using a GFI outlet and a manual switch instead of unplugging the chest freezer? When you turn off a GFI outlet and a manual switch, it only turns off the hot, leaving the ground available. This means my chest freezer is still grounded. So if there's any stray voltage in there, in the very unlikely event that something discharges, it's most likely going to discharge to the chassis of the chest freezer and go directly to the ground port of the outlet. If you unplug your chest freezer, not only will you have to wait a few minutes for that capacitor to dissipate, but your chest freezer may not be grounded at all. At the very least, the resistance will be greatly increased. If you unplug your chest freezer and there's any stray voltage in there, there's a chance that you may be the conduit getting in and getting out. Look, I fully acknowledge that these scenarios are incredibly unlikely, but to each their own. This is just my way of thinking. Please, at the very least, unplug your chest freezer before you use it. Marcus came over to help me with the last steps on his chest freezer. I combined using these rubber P-clips with these magnetic mounts. I ran it down the back and it makes it look real professional. And lastly, to go with the theme of the red sign, the white chest freezer, and the blue pond armor, we added a patriotic decal. Marcus said each time before he gets in there, he's gonna plunge allegiance. Again, this is just aesthetic choice, but I like to personalize these. I put bear prints on my polar box, and the American flag on Marcus's plunge of allegiance. And that's it, guys. I'm very happy with how this turned out. We took a $150 chest freezer, refurbished it, and made it into a professional-looking, self-sustaining cold plunge. It looks great, it's really well protected, it'll maintain the temperatures you need, it'll filter itself, it'll sanitize itself, and requires very little back end. And best of all, the price. For all the supplies to do this chest freezer conversion, it was about $750. And that number is kind of malleable. If you want to omit some things, you can probably save even a little bit more money as well. But when it comes to cold plunges, I don't think there's a better deal. And that's it. Marcus loved how it looked, and he was excited to get in his new cold plunge. Well guys, if you made it this far, I want to say thank you so much for checking out this video. If you found it useful, please leave a like. Be sure to comment below if I missed anything. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. If you know somebody who's interested in cold plunging, be sure to share this video with them. With this video, I wanted to show how I built my cold plunge. Other people may do it differently, and that's okay. Whatever works for you. If a chest freezer conversion sounds like something you want to do, I'd rather you have more information than not. There's a great book by John Richter on chest freezer conversions. Although I did some things differently than him, I still found his book very useful. He's knowledgeable on the topic and passionate. He also has a YouTube channel where he dedicates a lot of his time to the topic, so maybe check that out as well. A couple more things I wanted to mention. I now have a Patreon. I know it takes me a while to put out these videos, but I put a lot of time and energy into them. If you want to show some support and you can, and you have the funds to do so, it's greatly appreciated. Speaking of which, I gotta shout out my Patreon supporters, Barb Martin and Marcus McLaurin. Thanks guys for being my first Patreon members. I want to shout out my buddy Dan Bolanger. Dan has a podcast called Dan's Den. If you're a fan of Andrew Huberman type stuff and you want a little bit more casual atmosphere, check it out, it's worth it. I've been on there a couple times and the topics are great. Be sure to check out my other social media. I do things from music to filmmaking to astrophotography. I'm kind of all over the map here. Well, thanks again guys, and you take care. See you in the next one.